I remember the exact moment I understood what silence could do. It was a Tuesday morning in March, and I was standing in my bedroom doorway with my mother behind me. The room was empty, not messy empty, not temporarily rearranged empty, completely, systematically emptied. Every piece of furniture, every photograph, every single thing that was mine gone. The carpet still had indentations where my bed had been. A dust outline marked the place my desk used to sit. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there, breathing slowly, and felt something in my chest rearrange itself into a shape I didn't recognize yet. My mother wouldn't meet my eyes. "It's temporary," she said, her voice small and rehearsed, like she'd practiced those two words in the mirror. "Just temporary until we figure some things out." But I already knew it wasn't temporary. I could see it in the way her hands trembled at her sides. I could hear it in the hollowness of her voice, the same way she'd sounded last month when she told me Dad was having space issues in the marriage. The same tone she'd used when she explained that my college fund had been borrowed against for a business investment that didn't work out. I was 19 years old, and my family had spent the last 6 months quietly disassembling my life while I slept. My name is Rachel Morrison. This is how they destroyed me, and this is how I learned that revenge doesn't scream, it whispers. Before that Tuesday, I need to tell you about the Thursday before. I was in my 3rd year at Hartfield University, studying business management. People said I was the type of person who had it together, straight A's, student council treasurer, the kind of girl who had plans. My father used to joke that I inherited his ruthless organizational gene, though he said it with pride, like it was something to celebrate. I had a small apartment off campus that my parents paid for. A studio, nothing fancy, $1,200 a month. My father handled the rent directly to the landlord. I thought that was generous. I thought a lot of things were generous. That Thursday, I came home to find my dad sitting on my bed, the only piece of furniture that was still there at this point, holding a folder. He looked tired, not the kind of tired you get from a long day. The kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for too long and finally setting it down. "We need to talk about some financial things," he said. I sat down next to him. He didn't open the folder immediately. He just held it in his lap, running his thumb over the edge. "The investment I told you about last year," he started. "The tech startup your mother and I put money into. It didn't just underperform, Rachel. It collapsed. Completely. We lost $240,000. I remember my stomach dropping. That was my future he was describing. That was graduate school. That was my independence. "That's the college fund," I said quietly. "Yes. All of it. Most of it." He finally opened the folder. Inside were documents I didn't fully understand, investor agreements, bankruptcy notices, lawyer letters. His handwriting was on several of the pages, scrawled notes in the margins that looked almost violent in their intensity. "The investment was through a company your Uncle Marcus was advising on," my father continued. "He told us it was completely safe. He said his firm had vetted everything. He said." He stopped. He looked at his hands. "He lied," I finished for him. My father nodded slowly. "There are other investors," he said. "Lawsuits being filed. Our lawyer thinks we might have a case against the company, but it's going to take time and money we don't have. We're going to have to make some adjustments." By adjustments, what he meant was, stop paying for your apartment, stop funding your life, stop being a financial priority. What I didn't understand, what I couldn't possibly have understood, was that this conversation wasn't really about money at all. It was the first move in a game that had already begun without me. To understand what they took from me, you need to understand who I was before they took it. I grew up as the middle child of 5 kids. My older sister Emma was the beauty, the social one, the girl who made friends everywhere she went. My older brother James was the athlete, the confident one, always at the center of everything. I had 2 younger siblings, twins named David and Sophie, who were boisterous and dramatic and demanded constant attention. And then there was me, Rachel, the quiet one, the one who observed, the one who understood systems. I was the kid who reorganized the pantry because it made sense to organize by food group and expiration date. The kid who started a color-coded spreadsheet of our family's expenses when I was 12 because I noticed our parents fighting about money at night with their bedroom door closed. The kid who read every contract my parents asked me to look over, even before I understood law. My grandmother used to say I had an old soul. What she meant was, I was the kind of person who noticed things other people missed. By the time I got to Hartfield University, I'd become someone people relied on. My roommate asked me to help organize her schedule. My friends asked me to mediate their conflicts. One girl in my dorm actually paid me $50 to help her create a budget. I wasn't trying to be a fixer. It just happened naturally, the way some people are naturally tall. My parents had always encouraged this. "Rachel has a sharp mind," my mother would say. "She's going to do something important." My father would nod, satisfied, like he'd already decided what important thing that would be. The plan was always clear. I would graduate, get an MBA, work in business for a few years, then take over the family's real estate holdings. My father had built a small empire, 17 rental properties across 3 states. Nothing massive, but substantial, profitable, stable. "You're the one who can grow this," he'd told me 100 times. "Your brothers don't have the mind for it. Your sisters aren't interested. It has to be you." I'd accepted this as fact, the way you accept that the sun rises in the east. This was my destiny. This was the thing I was built for. So when my father told me about the failed investment, my first instinct wasn't anger. It was calculation. My mind immediately went to the numbers. How much I'd actually need to finish my degree, what I could cut from my expenses, whether this delayed the timeline or destroyed it entirely. "How long until the lawsuit settles?" I asked him that Thursday. 2 to 3 years, probably, maybe longer. "And in the meantime?" He closed the folder carefully, like it might break if he wasn't gentle. "In the meantime, we adjust." That's when he told me that my parents had decided I should move back home, that they couldn't afford the apartment anymore, that I would need to transfer to a state school closer to home to keep my costs down, that I would need to get a real job, not just student work study, to help support myself. I listened to all of this with the kind of calm that comes from shock. My brain was already working, already calculating, already trying to find a solution that would minimize the damage. "Okay," I said. "When?" "This weekend. We'll rent a truck. We'll get everything and bring it home. We're setting up a space for you in the basement. It's nice down there. We've been working on it." That's when I should have asked them why they were dismantling my life. That's when I should have demanded an explanation for why they were making these choices without consulting me. That's when I should have understood that something deeper was happening, something more complex than a failed investment and financial hardship. But I didn't. I just nodded and said, "Okay, I'll start packing." I was still operating under the assumption that my family loved me. The thing about betrayal is that it never announces itself clearly. It comes in layers. First, there's the small lie, then the justification, then the bigger lie that contradicts the first one, then the version of events that involves you being wrong, ungrateful, unrealistic. By the time you understand what's happening, you're already so deep in confusion that you can't tell up from down. That's what the next 2 weeks felt like. I moved home on a Saturday in early March. My father had rented a truck. My brothers helped load everything. It was almost cheerful, the way they approached it, laughing, making jokes about how small my apartment was, how little stuff I actually had. I remember James saying something like, "Rachel, you live like a monk," and everyone laughing, and me laughing too, because it was easier than not laughing. The basement room they'd prepared was actually nice. I had to give them that. They'd painted it a soft gray. There was a queen-size bed, new, still smelling like plastic and manufacturing chemicals. A desk, bookshelves, decent lighting. It looked like they'd actually put thought into it. "We wanted you to be comfortable," my mother said, standing in the doorway while I unloaded boxes. She had that same small, rehearsed voice. While you're home, while we get things sorted. While I'm home, like home was a temporary destination. The first few days, I didn't think much of it. I was tired from the move. I was dealing with the logistics of transferring to the state school, which my parents had already enrolled me in without asking. I discovered, when the acceptance letter arrived and my father casually mentioned he'd submitted my application using my information. But then things started getting strange. On the fourth day home, I went to the kitchen to find my mother doing something on her laptop at the dining room table. The screen went black as soon as I walked in, that quick, guilty gesture of closing a window you don't want someone to see. "What are you working on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "Just some bills," she said, not looking at me. Later that evening, I overheard my parents talking quietly in their bedroom. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop. I was just walking past to get to the bathroom. But I heard my uncle's name, Uncle Marcus, the one who'd advised on the failed investment. I heard my father say something that made my stomach tighten. "She has to believe it was her fault." I stopped in the hallway. My hand froze on the bathroom doorknob. "She has to believe what was her fault." My mother's voice came back, confused or maybe pretending to be confused. "The money, the apartment, all of it. She has to believe that she did something wrong, that she disappointed us, that this is a natural consequence of." "That's cold," my mother said, but she didn't sound opposed. She sounded like someone acknowledging a fact. "It's necessary," my father replied. I went into the bathroom and locked the door. I sat on the bathroom floor for 20 minutes with the exhaust fan running loud enough to cover any sound I might make. My hands were shaking. They were doing this on purpose. Whatever this was, they were deliberately making me believe something false. Over the next week, the pieces started to come together in a way that made everything worse. My Uncle Marcus came to the house. I found out later that he'd been coming regularly, meeting with my parents in my father's office with the door closed. I only knew he was there because I heard his car pull into the driveway and heard his distinctive laugh, that loud, booming laugh that had always made me uncomfortable for reasons I couldn't articulate. On one of these visits, I was in my basement room when my father came downstairs. He looked like he'd been crying, though his eyes were dry now. He sat on the edge of my bed without asking if he could. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to understand that this is coming from a place of love." Those are famous last words. Those are the words that precede the knife. "When you were 8 years old, we started putting money aside for your education," he began. "We made some choices about how to invest it, and we trusted the wrong people with the administration of those funds." He paused, like he was gathering courage. "Your Uncle Marcus was one of those people. And Rachel, sweetheart, I think he may have taken some of that money." I remember my mouth going dry. "What do you mean taken?" I asked. "Misappropriated, invested it in ways that weren't authorized, created fake statements so we wouldn't know what was really happening. By the time we realized, there wasn't much left to recover." The way he said it was so matter-of-fact. The way he presented it as something that had happened to him, not something he was doing to me. "But you said it was a failed investment," I said slowly. "You said the startup collapsed." "That's what I told you because I didn't want you to know how deep this went," my father said. "I didn't want you to have to carry that burden. The investment was real, but it was the last piece of what was left after Marcus had already taken most of it." I felt something heavy settle in my chest. I wanted to ask him why he was telling me this now. I wanted to ask him what this had to do with my apartment, my school, my life being dismantled. But instead, I just listened while he explained that my uncle was working with us to try to recover what he'd stolen, that it was all very complicated, that they were trying to protect me from the details. "The key thing," my father said, "is that we need you to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. We need you to understand that sometimes families go through hard times, and the way we get through them is by sacrificing together." I nodded numbly. "Your mother and I are making cuts everywhere," he continued. "Real cuts, selling properties, cutting our own expenses, asking all of your siblings to contribute if they can. We're all doing our part. and we need you to do your part too." By the time he left my room, I had accepted his version of events. I had made it my fault. I had convinced myself that the least I could do, given that my family was suffering because of my uncle's theft, was to quietly accept my diminished life. What I didn't understand yet was that I was watching a master class in manipulation, and I was the student. The gaslighting doesn't happen all at once. That's what makes it so effective. It comes as small contradictions. My father said one thing on a Monday, and by Wednesday he'd corrected himself, acted like he'd never said it that way, made me question whether I'd understood him correctly. My mother would tell me she was going to pick me up from campus, and then not be there, and when I called the house, she'd act confused, like I'd gotten the date wrong, like this was my mistake. Small things, but they added up. I started a new job at a retail store in late March. Minimum wage, 20 hours a week. The money I made went straight to my parents. This was part of our family sacrifice arrangement. I worked Thursday through Sunday evenings, which meant I was missing social events at campus, missing study groups, missing the normal rhythms of student life. My friends started asking questions. They wanted to know why I was never available. They wanted to know why I was suddenly working so much when I was supposed to be focused on my grades. I made up stories. I said I wanted to save for a car. I said I was helping my parents with bills. None of it was a lie exactly, but none of it was the whole truth either. And then there was Uncle Marcus. He started appearing at the house frequently. He'd come for dinner and act like nothing was wrong, like he wasn't a man who'd allegedly stolen from his own brother's child's future. He'd ask me about school in that booming voice, and I'd answer politely, and he'd laugh that laugh that made my skin crawl. But here's the thing, and this is where I started to understand something was wrong with the story my father had told me. Uncle Marcus kept saying things that didn't add up. "Your dad told me you're handling this really maturely," he said once, when we were alone in the kitchen while he waited for my mother to finish getting ready. "Most kids your age would be angry. They'd blame their family, but you're stepping up." I didn't remember agreeing to be blamed or praised for how I was handling something I still didn't fully understand. "I'm sorry you're all dealing with this," I said carefully. "Oh, this will all get worked out," he said, waving his hand dismissively. "Your dad's a sharp guy. He's got a plan, you'll see. Everything's going to be fine." That casual confidence bothered me. If he'd stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars from his brother, wouldn't he be nervous? Wouldn't he be frightened of consequences? I started noticing other things. I found financial statements in my father's office that didn't match what he'd told me about his real estate holdings. The numbers were different. More properties listed than I'd ever heard him mention. Rental income that seemed much higher than what he'd described. One night, while everyone was asleep, I did something that I'd been raised not to do. I went into my father's office and I opened the filing cabinet. I found folders organized by property address. I started going through them, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every single property was listed as being owned jointly with Uncle Marcus. My hands were shaking as I photographed the documents with my phone. I didn't even know why I was doing it. I just knew that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with the story I'd been told. By the beginning of April, I'd been home for a month. I was working 2 jobs by then, the retail store plus weekend work at a local bank helping with data entry. I was exhausted. My grades were slipping. I'd missed 3 classes because of scheduling conflicts. One of my professors sent me an email asking if everything was okay. I remember reading that email and thinking, how do I explain that my family is slowly erasing me? That's when the accusations started. It was a Saturday morning. My mother came downstairs where I was eating cereal before heading to work. She looked angry, which was unusual. My mother was usually passive, soft-spoken, careful. "Your father found some things on the credit card statement," she said without preamble. "Charges to your account that he didn't authorize." I set down my spoon carefully. "What charges?" "Online purchases. Clothing, books, other items. Hundreds of dollars. Your father is very upset, Rachel. He said you were supposed to be helping us, and instead you're spending money you don't have. I felt my face flush. I bought a few things in March, maybe 5 things total, for school. I paid for them with my own money from my first paycheck. Your father says the charges were made before you started working. That was true. I had bought 3 books for a business class before I got the job at the retail store. But I'd used my debit card, which was connected to my own separate account that my grandfather had set up for me when I was born. It wasn't my parents' money. It was my own account, I said. It was an account your father helped establish, my mother said coldly. An account he could have claimed was for your future, an account you have no right to access without permission. I wanted to argue. I wanted to explain that I had every right to access my own account. But I was 19, and my mother was standing in the kitchen looking at me like I'd betrayed her, and some part of me had internalized the message I'd been receiving for the past month. I was the problem. I was the burden. I was the reason my family was suffering. I'm sorry, I said. I didn't think. You never think about anyone but yourself, my mother said, and she said it so quietly, with such resigned sadness, that it felt like the most accurate assessment of my character anyone had ever made. That afternoon, my father came home from a business meeting. He called me into the living room. My mother was there, sitting on the couch, looking small and tired. Your mother told me about the credit card situation, my father said. He didn't sit down. He stood with his arms crossed, the posture of a man who was disappointed beyond the capacity to express it. I said I was sorry. I started. I don't want to hear sorry, he said. I want to understand why you felt like you had the right to spend money when this family is in financial crisis. I want to understand why your education, your future, your freedom are worth more to you than your family's survival. I opened my mouth. I closed it. I had no answer to that because the premise was false, but I couldn't figure out how to say that without sounding defensive, and I'd learned by then that defending myself only made things worse. We've made a decision, my father continued. We're going to restrict your access to your own account. We're going to monitor any spending. And any money you make from now on, beyond what you need for transportation and lunch, is going to come directly to us. Do you understand? That's not legal, I heard myself say. That's my money from my grandfather's trust. My father's face went cold. Your grandfather's money was meant for your future, he said. And your future right now requires your family staying afloat. If you're too selfish to understand that, then yes, I will take control of it. I will be the trustee, and you will not access a single penny without my permission. My mother started crying softly on the couch. I don't know what happened to you, she said, looking at me. You used to be so kind, so thoughtful. When did you become so cruel? I felt something break inside me. Not dramatically, not all at once. Just a small, precise fracture, like a hairline crack in glass. I was 19 years old. I was isolated from my friends. I was working 2 jobs. I was being told I was selfish, cruel, ungrateful. I was watching my family slowly rewrite the narrative of my own life. And I still didn't understand what was really happening. The moment I stopped crying was the moment everything changed. It was a Tuesday night in mid-April. I was in my basement room, lying in the dark, and I was thinking about dropping out of school. I was thinking about just accepting that this was my life now, work, home, until I was old enough that I could leave and never come back. I was thinking about becoming the person my family had told me I was, selfish, ungrateful, a burden. And then I remembered something my grandmother had said to me when I was 14. I was upset about something, I don't even remember what. Typical teenage drama. And my grandmother had found me crying in the backyard, and she sat down next to me and said, Rachel, you have a sharp mind. Don't let anyone dull it for you. Don't let anyone convince you that your thinking is wrong just because it's different from theirs. I'd forgotten that. Somewhere in the last month, I'd forgotten that I was the person who organized pantries, who understood systems, who could see patterns that other people missed. And the pattern I'd been missing was the most important one. I got out of bed. I turned on my phone's light and opened a new note. I started writing down every conversation I could remember with my parents over the past month. Every contradiction. Everything my father had said that didn't line up with something he'd said before. Every time my mother had acted like I was crazy for remembering something that I definitely remembered. I wrote down the property documents I'd photographed. I wrote down the dates. I wrote down what I'd seen on my father's financial statements. And then I did something I'd never done before. I started planning. Not a response, not an argument, not an apology or a capitulation. I started planning a defense. But not the kind of defense where I argued back. The kind of defense where I gathered evidence, where I built a case, where I made sure that when the moment came, I wouldn't be standing alone saying, he said, she said. The next morning, I did something ordinary. I asked my parents if I could transfer back to Hartfield for the spring semester. They'd been pressuring me to stay at the state school, but I used their own logic against them. The state school doesn't have the business program I want, I said quietly. If I'm going to do this right, I need the better program. Hartfield's ranking is better. My job prospects will be better. It's an investment in my future, which helps the family long term. I could see my father trying to find a reason to refuse. But he couldn't because I'd used his own language, his own values. Business logic, investment logic, future thinking. The tuition is the same, I added. The scholarship covers most of it. I just need the apartment. My mother and father exchanged a look that I couldn't quite read. We'll discuss it, my father said. But I could already tell they were going to say yes. They needed me to believe that they were letting me have something, even if what they were letting me have was something I'd already won. A week later, my father called me into the living room. We've decided you can go back, he said. But there are going to be changes to how we handle your money. We're going to be more involved in your spending. We're going to need to see your grades, and you're going to need to check in with us regularly. Do you understand? I nodded obediently. What I understood was that my father was nervous. If he wasn't nervous, he wouldn't need these controls. If everything was fine, if he really was just a victim of my uncle's theft, if he really was just trying to teach me responsibility, he wouldn't need to monitor me this carefully. I moved back into my apartment in May. I told my parents I was grateful. I sent them thank you messages. I made myself small and quiet and grateful, the perfect image of a repentant daughter who'd learned her lesson. And in the background, I started gathering evidence. I opened a new email account that my parents couldn't access. I went through the financial documents I'd photographed. I started researching laws around trust funds, around what a parent could and couldn't do with money that had been given to a child by a grandparent. I called my grandfather's law firm from a college library computer. I said I wanted to know about the terms of my trust. I said I'd been given some information that contradicted what I understood about how it worked. The lawyer I spoke to sounded concerned. She asked me several detailed questions. She told me she would send me a copy of the original trust document directly to an email address of my choosing. I asked it to be sent to my new secret email. When I received and read it, I felt something cold and clear settle into my stomach. The trust was irrevocable. The money was mine. My father had no legal right to restrict my access to it beyond age 18, which I had already passed. More importantly, the document specified exactly what the money was for: my education and my independent living expenses until age 25. My father had violated the terms of my grandfather's trust, and he'd done it consciously, deliberately, knowing that I wouldn't know enough about law to challenge him. I was no longer thinking about how I could salvage this situation or make my family love me again. I was thinking about how I could prove what they'd done. From June through August, I lived a double life. During the day, I was the good daughter. I called my parents on Sundays. I sent them updates about my classes. I thanked them for their sacrifice. I played the role so perfectly that sometimes I forgot it was a role at all. At night, I became someone else, someone cold, someone calculating, someone who understood that love was a weapon and I'd been hit with it repeatedly, and now I was going to pick it up and use it differently. I hired a lawyer. I used some of my trust money, which I'd finally reclaimed, accessing it directly through the bank once I understood my legal rights, to hire Catherine Chen, an attorney who specialized in financial elder abuse and family legal disputes. She was expensive. I spent $1,500 on the first consultation. She was also brilliant. "Walk me through everything again," she said, and I did. I told her about the property documents, about the financial statements, about the contradictions in what my father had told me. I showed her the trust document. I showed her my notes from conversations. She listened without interrupting, making notes in a leather notebook with a pen that looked like it probably cost more than I made in a week. "This is either very complicated or very simple," she said when I finished. "Either your father is genuinely a victim of fraud by your uncle, or he's using that story to justify his own financial manipulation of you. Do you have the courage to find out which one it is?" I thought about my mother crying on the couch. I thought about my father's cold face when he'd told me I was cruel and selfish. I thought about a month of my life spent believing I was the problem when I'd done nothing wrong. "Yes," I said. "Then here's what we're going to do," Catherine said, and she outlined a plan that was so perfect, so precise, that I felt my entire body relax for the first time in months. First, we were going to subpoena the financial records from my father's business. Not everything, just the property documents and the records from the past 3 years. Catherine said we had legal grounds to do this based on my claim that I'd been denied access to trust funds that were legally mine. Second, we were going to interview my uncle Marcus, not confrontationally, just as part of gathering information about the failed investment. Catherine had a colleague who was a forensic accountant who could help us analyze the documents once we had them. Third, and this was the part that made me understand Catherine was not someone to be underestimated, we were going to record any conversations with my parents. Not secretly. That would be illegal in our state. We were going to set up situations where I could tell them I wanted to record the conversation, for clarity, and get their consent on tape. "If your father is legitimate in his claims, he'll have no problem with you recording conversations," Catherine said. "If he pushes back, that tells us something." He pushed back immediately. When I called him in late June and said I wanted to have a recorded conversation about finances so I could understand better, he reacted like I'd accused him of a crime. "That's not how families work," he said, his voice hard. "You either trust me or you don't, and asking to record me tells me you don't." "I just want to understand the details," I said, keeping my voice small and uncertain. "I'm confused about some things." "Then ask me clearly and I'll answer clearly," he said. "But I'm not being recorded. That's final." I hung up the phone and sent the transcript of that conversation to Catherine, along with a note. "He just refused to be recorded. What do you think that means?" She replied within an hour. "It means he knows something he doesn't want documented. It means he's protecting himself. It means you're on the right track." By late July, Catherine had the financial records from my father's business. I was allowed to review them in her office, under supervision, which meant I couldn't take them with me, but I could photograph every page that was relevant. What I found was worse than I'd expected. My uncle Marcus wasn't just an advisor on one failed investment. He was listed as a partner on nearly every one of my father's properties. More importantly, they were listed as joint tenants, which meant if anything happened to my father, Uncle Marcus would automatically own all of the properties. But there was more. There were internal communications, emails printed out and included in the files, between my father and Uncle Marcus discussing something called the contingency. The emails were vague, but the implication was clear. They were discussing what would happen to assets if my father was no longer around. My father wasn't a victim. My father was a participant, and whatever my uncle had done with the investment money, my father had been complicit. By August, Catherine had called a meeting with my Uncle Marcus's attorney. This was an official attorney-to-attorney conversation, completely above board. Catherine told the attorney that her client, me, believed she had been financially defrauded as a minor by the mismanagement of her trust funds, and that we were prepared to file suit unless we received a detailed accounting of what had happened to the money that had been invested in the failed startup. Marcus's attorney responded with a settlement offer. They were willing to pay back $75,000 immediately if I agreed to sign a document saying I would never discuss the matter with anyone, never file suit, and never investigate further. Catherine showed me the offer in her office. She didn't recommend accepting it. "He's panicking," she said. "He wouldn't make this offer if he wasn't worried, which means there's more to find, which means we keep going." I told them no. I said I wanted full accounting of every penny, or I was filing suit against both my father and my uncle. 2 weeks later, my father called me. "We need to talk about what your lawyer has been doing," he said. His voice was carefully controlled, which somehow made it more terrifying than anger would have been. "Okay," I said. "She's been making accusations, serious accusations, about me and about Marcus. This is hurting our family." "I didn't make any accusations," I said. "She did. She's my lawyer." "You hired her," my father said. "You made this choice. You decided that your family wasn't important enough to protect. You decided that money was more important than loyalty." I felt it then, that old tug, the guilt, the sense that maybe I was the bad person in this story. And then I remembered the look on my mother's face when she asked me when I'd become so cruel. I remembered my father's cold certainty as he told me I was selfish. I remembered a month of my life erased from my own basement bedroom. "I need to go," I said. "I have class." "Rachel." I hung up. Then I sent Catherine a message. "He just tried to manipulate me again. I'm done waiting. What's the next move?" The big twist came in September, completely unexpectedly. Catherine called me to her office on a Tuesday morning. I'd skipped my first class to meet with her, and she'd said it was important. When I arrived, she wasn't alone. There was a man I'd never seen before in his 50s, dressed in an expensive suit. "This is Detective James Morrison," Catherine said, and my stomach dropped at the name. "He's not related to you, despite the shared surname. He's a fraud investigator with the State Attorney General's office. He's been looking into your father's business practices for the last 6 months." I didn't understand. I must have looked as confused as I felt, because the detective smiled sadly and gestured for me to sit down. "Your father is not a victim of your uncle's fraud," he said without preamble. "Your father is the architect of a much more complex scheme. Your uncle is involved, but he's not the mastermind. That's your father." He placed a folder on Catherine's desk. Inside were more documents, emails, bank statements, financial records. "What your father and uncle have been doing is called trade-based money laundering," the detective continued. "They've been using your father's rental properties to move money from one place to another, making it look legitimate. The failed investment was a cover story to explain why the money had suddenly disappeared from the trust account. It never failed. It was never a real investment. It was moved deliberately to hide it from authorities." I remember my hands were shaking. I remember saying, "I don't understand money laundering, like illegal." "Like very illegal," the detective said. "We're talking federal charges. We're talking potentially significant prison time. And what your father did to you, controlling your trust fund, gaslighting you about the reason why, using you as part of the cover story, that's all part of the pattern. He was establishing that the money was gone, that you were in financial difficulty, that he was a struggling parent trying to do the right thing. He was creating witnesses who would swear that he was a victim." I felt the room tilt sideways. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. The detective and Catherine exchanged a look. "Because we need your help," Catherine said quietly. "The State Attorney General is building a case, but they need evidence, testimony, cooperation, and more importantly, they need to move quickly before your father realizes what's happening and tries to hide assets or run." "How long do I have?" I asked. 3 weeks, the detective said. "Maybe 4. We're moving to arrest him, but we want to do it in a way that maximizes our ability to recover the assets. Once we arrest him, he'll get a lawyer, and any cooperation becomes much harder. So if you're going to help us, it needs to be now." I thought about my mother. I thought about my siblings. I thought about my grandmother. I thought about all of them finding out that our father had committed federal crimes and had tried to use me as his alibi. What do I need to do? I asked. The plan was this. Catherine and the detective would arrange a meeting with my father. Catherine would say it was a settlement negotiation, that I was willing to drop my lawsuit if he agreed to pay me back the money plus damages. They would record the meeting. They would try to get him to admit on tape what he'd done. But I wanted to do something else. I wanted to confront him, not for justice, not for evidence, just for me. I wanted to look my father in the face and let him know that I knew the truth. That's not advisable, Catherine said when I told her. It could compromise the case. It could give him warning. It could. I don't care, I said. I need to do this, please. So we arranged it differently. The meeting would be at my apartment, with Catherine and the detective hidden in the bedroom, recording everything on audio. I would confront him. And when the moment was right, I would mention the money laundering, just to see how he reacted. My father arrived on a Thursday evening in mid-September. He looked tired. He looked old. He looked like a man who hadn't slept well in a long time. "Rachel," he said, pulling me into a hug I didn't return. "This needs to stop. This legal warfare needs to stop. You're my daughter. I love you. I don't want to fight with you." I led him to the living room. I sat down on one chair. He sat down on the couch. "I know what you did," I said quietly. He went very still. "What do you think I did?" he asked carefully. "I know there was no failed investment. I know you moved money from my trust account deliberately. I know you lied about it and told me it was my fault, that I was selfish and ungrateful. I know you were gaslighting me." My father's face went carefully blank. "Your trust account was always going to be restricted," he said. "Your grandfather understood that at 19, you weren't mature enough to access substantial sums of money. I was his trustee. I made the decision he would have wanted." "That's not what the trust document says," I said. "I had a lawyer read it. The money is completely mine. You had no right." "Your lawyer is giving you bad advice," my father said, and his voice was still so calm, so reasonable. "We should sit down with a better attorney, someone who understands family law, and discuss this properly." "I also know about the money laundering," I said. The effect was immediate. The color drained from his face. He opened his mouth, closed it, and for the first time since I'd been home that month, I saw my father looking genuinely afraid. "Who told you that?" he asked. "Does it matter?" I said. "Rachel, you don't understand," he said, and now his voice was losing that careful control. "You don't understand the pressure we were under. Your mother and I, we had responsibilities. We had 5 children and a mortgage and debt, and yes, I made some choices that weren't perfect, but—" "You chose to steal from me," I said quietly. "You chose to lie about it. You chose to make me believe that I was the problem." "That's not what I did." And then when I started asking questions, when I started trying to understand, you made me feel crazy. You told me I was cruel and selfish. You told me I was hurting the family. You isolated me. You controlled me. You used me as part of your cover story. My father stood up. He walked to the window. He stood there for a long moment, looking out at the street. When he turned back to me, he looked like he'd aged 10 years. "I need to talk to a lawyer," he said. "There's one in my bedroom," I said. He looked at me like I'd physically struck him. "You've been recording this," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Who else is here?" "A detective from the state attorney general's office." I watched my father realize that his daughter, the quiet one, the one he'd manipulated and gaslit and isolated, had become the person who would destroy him. I watched him understand that he'd made a catastrophic error in underestimating me. He didn't say anything else. He just walked toward the bedroom, where Catherine was already opening the door, where the detective was waiting with handcuffs and a warrant and the full weight of federal law enforcement behind him. And I sat alone in my living room and listened to my father being arrested. The trial was 6 months later. By that time, my father had been formally charged with money laundering, wire fraud, and financial exploitation of a minor. My uncle Marcus had taken a plea deal. My mother had hired a separate lawyer and was cooperating with authorities in exchange for immunity. The prosecution called me as a witness. I sat in the stand and answered questions about what my father had told me, about the documents I'd seen, about the way he'd controlled my finances and isolated me from my support system. My father's lawyer tried to make me sound like a confused teenager who'd misunderstood her father's intentions. I stayed calm. I answered every question directly. I didn't let myself get angry or defensive. I just told the truth. The jury deliberated for 4 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts. When the judge announced the sentence, 8 years in federal prison, restitution of $450,000, my father didn't show any reaction. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, like he'd already accepted this alternate future. What he never accepted was what came after. The money was recovered. Not all of it, some had already been moved too far through the money laundering system, but most of it came back. And per the terms of the trust, it went to me. It went to my education. It went to my independence. But more than that, it went to my freedom from him. The aftermath was messy. My family fractured in ways that I didn't expect. My mother had to rebuild her life. My siblings had to process the fact that the man they'd known their entire lives was someone completely different from who they thought he was. My grandmother mourned the loss of her son, even knowing what he'd done. And I had to learn how to live without the person I'd been constructed to become. I changed my major from business to law. I started volunteering with a nonprofit that helps people recover from financial abuse. I stopped trying to be the person who fixed everything and started being the person who asked for help when I needed it. I finished my degree in the time I was supposed to. I got into a good law school. I started a life that was actually mine, not designed by someone else. But the real victory wasn't the trial or the conviction or even recovering my money. The real victory was understanding something that my younger self couldn't have known, that the quiet ones are often the ones paying attention. That manipulation always leaves traces. That sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to accept someone else's version of your own story. It's been 3 years now. My father has served 2 years of his 8-year sentence. He's eligible for parole in 4 more years. And I'm not sure what I'll do when that happens. Part of me hopes I'll be indifferent by then. Part of me thinks I'll still care, still be affected by his release. I try not to think about it too much. What I think about instead is the day I stood in my bedroom doorway and saw that my entire life had been erased while I slept. What I think about is how that moment of shock and betrayal became the thing that saved me, because it forced me to see what I couldn't see before. It forced me to stop accepting other people's narratives and start building my own. I'm sitting in a coffee shop right now, a place that's become my favorite study spot. Law school students study at the table next to me. The barista knows my order. Someone I don't know just smiled at me as they walked past, the kind of small human connection that means nothing and everything at the same time. I am 23 years old. I have my life back. I have my mind back. I have my future back, and this time no one else owns it. My grandmother called me yesterday. She said she was proud of me. She said she always knew I had a sharp mind. She said she was sorry she hadn't protected me from my father, and I told her there was nothing to apologize for, that I'd needed to learn how to protect myself. The last time I saw my mother, we sat in a coffee shop. Not this one, a different one, and she cried. Not the performative tears I remember from before, but real tears, real regret. She told me she'd let my father convince her that what he was doing was necessary, that it was my fault for asking too many questions, that everything would be fine if I would just be more grateful. I let you down, she said, and then I let him convince me that you'd let me down first. I didn't say it was okay because it wasn't. Instead, I said, I forgive you. And I meant it, because holding on to anger was like drinking poison and expecting it to hurt the person who'd hurt me. But I also meant it in a different way. I forgave her because understanding her helped me understand myself. Because she was also a victim, just not in the way she'd pretended to be. Because forgiveness doesn't mean reconciliation, it means freedom. The most important thing I learned is this: they underestimated me, all of them. My father thought I was too naive to notice his contradictions. My mother thought I was too dependent on their approval to challenge them. My uncle thought I was too young to understand what was really happening. They were wrong. I was the quiet one. I was the observer. I was the person who understood systems and patterns and how things fit together. And when they tried to use those qualities against me, when they tried to make me the problem instead of looking at themselves, they forgot that those same qualities would let me build a case against them. They forgot that sometimes the meek don't just inherit the earth. Sometimes they inherit justice. I finish my coffee. I pack my laptop. I walk back toward campus, where I have a study group in an hour and a life that is completely, unmistakably, irrevocably my own. This is my story. This is what I survived. And more than that, this is what I became.